$10 million? Where did you get it? Yes, where? That's a lot of money.
You have to tell us, now.
Please, just explain. I can't tell you. It's private.
Private, this is family business. Are you in trouble?
We deserve to know. Just trust me. We all deserve our share of that 10 million. Yes, give me my cut right now. Please. I need my share too. Don't
We all want our part.
Yes, family needs our
Fair shares from that money.
Let's start with Marco, because the rest of the story really grows from him. Some people in my family tried to reduce Marco to a number after he died, and those people deserve to know something real about him before I talk about what they did with that number. My name's Adais. I left for Rome at 26, hauling a suitcase, a budget I'd cobbled together over 2 years, and zero plans except spending 3 weeks somewhere that wasn't my hometown, a place where I figured people wouldn't look right through me the way my family always managed to do. And about that, I should explain before I dive into Rome. Imagine being the middle child in a group of 4. That's invisibility squared in most families. In mine, they turned it into something almost architectural, the specific, consistent way that attention always found somewhere else to go the moment I entered a room. Not outright cruelty. No stranger at our Sunday dinners would have noticed anything off. Just a kind of relentless, routine overlooking that had been the texture of my life for as long as I could remember. So consistent that it stopped feeling like something happening to me and started feeling like just the way things were. Diane, my older sister, got fanfares for whatever she accomplished. Kevin, the younger brother, got endless explanations and patience for his mistakes, the kind of patient investment you make in someone you've decided matters enough to figure out. Tanya, the youngest, barely had to ask, and whatever she wanted happened. Me? If anyone nodded in my direction, they were already looking past me before the nod fully landed. Was I resentful? Not exactly. You can't stay angry about something when, deep down, you never expected anything else. I adjusted my hopes a long time before I bought that plane ticket. If I'm honest, what I was, quietly and persistently, was tired. Tired of being useful Adais, the helpful blur hanging at the back of her own family story. Tired of the dim, consistent invisibility that felt like the only thing I was reliably going to inherit from the family I'd been born into. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from existing in a place where everyone else always seems to catch all the available light, and you've stopped expecting any of it to land on you. When I announced the trip, my mother warned me not to blow my savings, which was her way of expressing concern and doubt simultaneously in a single sentence, something she'd always been efficient at. Diane gave me one of her vague, "I hope you know what you're doing" comments, which I'd been receiving from Diane for most of my adult life in various contexts. Kevin barely grunted, which is Kevin all over when a conversation isn't primarily about Kevin. Tanya sent a sweet message when I left, which is very much her way. Kind, unless being kinder would require rearranging her schedule in any meaningful way. No going away party. No one seemed particularly fussed about the gap I'd leave. That told me everything I needed to know, and I packed my suitcase and got on the plane. I meant to stay 3 weeks. 6 years later, I was still there. That should tell you what I found in Rome, and what I hadn't found nearly enough of before I arrived. First, the city itself. Rome is a mess and a marvel. A place that never lets you drift, because the weight and age of everything forces you to pay attention to where you actually are, rather than floating through it. For someone who'd been floating through most of her life, that present tense insistence was shocking, and then perfect. I walked streets that had been there for 2,000 years and felt, for the first time in as long as I could remember, that I was actually standing somewhere real, and that standing there was itself a significant thing. That sounds like a small observation. It didn't feel small when it happened. Then I found Italian. After signing up for an evening beginner's class in Prati, a neighborhood on the west bank of the Tiber that I'd wandered into on my 3rd week and liked well enough to stay near. The school offered free weekly lectures on architectural history, and I went to the first one mostly because it was free and I was on a budget, not expecting much beyond a distraction. Marco Ferretti walked into that room on a Tuesday evening in October with the specific, unhurried energy of someone entirely at ease in his own skin, and spent an hour talking about the Pantheon in a way that made everyone present feel like they were encountering it for the first time, like the thing had been waiting specifically for this explanation to fully make sense. He was 71 years old, retired, and teaching this free community class simply because he enjoyed teaching, because he'd spent 40 years building things and had arrived at a point where what he wanted to do with his time was help other people understand them. At the end, he asked for questions. I raised my hand with something genuine, not something designed to sound clever, just a real question I'd been turning over during the lecture. How does a building that ancient feel so deliberately contemporary in its proportions? He looked at me with an expression I later came to recognize as one of his most characteristic, the focused attention of someone who was actually considering what you'd said, rather than preparing their response while you were still talking. He gave me a proper, detailed answer, not the simplified version, the real one. When everyone else had filed out, we spent another 40 minutes by the window, falling deep into architecture and the philosophy of public space, and when I finally left, I walked home in the dark feeling, oddly, like the most interesting version of myself. That was the real beginning, even though neither of us thought of it that way at the time. I went back the following Tuesday. Coffee after lecture started a month in. Dinner a month after that. We moved without rushing, which was part of what made it real, the patient accumulation of two people who were actually learning each other rather than performing the early stages of something for an audience. Marco deserves a proper description because he was a proper person. When we met, he was 71. When we married, he was 74. On paper, that's an old man. In real life, he was present in a way that made his age almost irrelevant, so vibrantly, specifically alive in every moment that the number felt like a category error when you were actually in a conversation with him. He'd been married before, decades earlier, and spoke about it with the honest clarity of someone who'd processed something completely, no bitterness left in it, no revision of the record to make himself look better in the telling. He had no children. He owned a large, beautiful apartment near the Pantheon, full of architectural drawings and books stacked on every available surface, and a property in Tuscany where he spent every August, and a way of being in a room that made everyone in it feel like the most interesting person present. With me, specifically, he was curious. Not the polite curiosity of someone making good conversation, but real, specific, sustained curiosity, the kind that remembers what you said last week and follows up on it this week, the kind that asks what you actually think rather than what you're expected to think. Nobody in my family had ever asked me what I thought about when I was walking around alone. Marco asked, and actually wanted the answer, and that particular question, the first time he asked it, landed in me like something that had been expected for a long time and never arrived. I called my mother when Marco and I had decided to get married. She was quiet for a moment, then asked his age. Then she paused again and said she hoped I knew what I was doing, which was the same thing she'd said when I left for Rome 3 years earlier, and which told me clearly that her model of who I was and what my judgment was worth hadn't updated, regardless of what had actually happened to me in the intervening years. I told her I did know, completely, and I did. The wedding was small, in the courtyard of Marco's building, with his close friends and the people I'd gathered to me over my years in Rome, the city having proved remarkably generous with the kinds of people I wanted around me. My family sent gifts and well wishes, and didn't come. I'd half expected this, and it sat in my chest with the familiar, manageable weight of something I'd learned not to be surprised by. We were married for 4 years. They were the best 4 years of my life, and I want to say that simply and completely without decorating it. Marco was a wonderful husband in the ways that are hardest to find, and most important when you do. The kind who made room without being asked, who knew when to talk and when to simply be present, who cooked Sunday dinners with the same focused attention he brought to everything, and who laughed genuinely and fully at things that were actually funny. We traveled when his health allowed, walked the city when it didn't, spent every August in Tuscany at his property, where the light in late afternoon does something to the hills that I still can't fully describe. He died in March, a stroke, fast. I wasn't home when it happened, and that detail sits with me still, the specific weight of it, coming home to find him gone rather than being there. He was 78. His heart had been a quiet concern for 2 years, carefully monitored, until one morning it simply wasn't manageable anymore. I stayed in Rome for a year after he died. I want to be honest about that year because it tends to get compressed in the telling, reduced to an administrative interlude between his death and my return, and it was considerably more than that. I grieved, the way you grieve someone who was specifically, irreplaceably important to your actual daily life. The ordinary, unglamorous version of grief that lives in small moments. Turning to say something and having nowhere to turn it. I settled the estate, which was a months-long process even with Marco's meticulous record-keeping and the kindest lawyers I could find. Everything came to me. His will was clean, updated annually, uncontested, because he had no children and no close relatives with any claim to make. The apartment, the Tuscany property, the investments, all of it liquidated and resolved, came to just over $10 million. I looked at that number for a long time before I did anything with it, because it had arrived attached to the death of the person who'd made my life larger than it had ever been, and that attachment made it feel, for months, more like a burden than a resource. More like the cost of something than the gain of anything. I came home for Christmas after nearly 6 years because the grief had settled into something I could carry rather than something that was carrying me, and because I was ready to begin whatever came next. I flew back with gifts and the particular, complicated feeling of someone returning to a place they'd left as one person and were returning to as someone considerably different, hoping the difference would be noticed. Hoping something about what I'd become would land on the people I'd grown up with. My family knew Marco had died. They knew broadly that he'd been a man of some means. What they didn't know was the actual number, because I hadn't told them, it not having seemed like the first or most important thing to lead with in conversations about losing my husband. Diane found out on Christmas morning. Diane had spent part of December doing what Diane does when she senses information she doesn't have access to, looking for it methodically and thoroughly. Italian architectural obituaries, property registry information, whatever could be accessed through European public records. Enough pieces to construct a reasonably accurate picture of the estate's value. She announced it to the entire family, right there in the living room surrounded by wrapping paper on Christmas morning, with the particular energy of someone presenting shared family news rather than private information she'd excavated without being asked, like she'd just read the winning lottery numbers and everybody needed to hear them immediately. Everything shifted. Fast. It wasn't subtle like a draft you barely notice. More like watching your room's atmosphere change in real time. The temperature of every relationship recalibrating simultaneously the moment the number landed. One moment I was Adais, the quiet one who'd gone to Rome and married an older Italian man and come back widowed, a mildly interesting story. The next moment I was Adais with $10 million, and something changed in how every person in that room was oriented toward me in a way that I felt immediately and which told me everything. Kevin found me before lunch with a business idea. He'd been developing a food distribution concept, apparently had been for a while, needed seed money to get it off the ground, $100,000 to start, maybe more later. He said it the way you say something you've already decided isn't going to be refused, with the casual confidence of someone who considers the conversation a formality before an outcome he's already assumed. I asked him for a business plan. He said he didn't quite have one yet, but could put something together. I told him to put something together and we could talk properly, which was more generous than the request deserved, and which he received as a delay rather than as a conditional response, his face doing something briefly unpleasant before the smile returned. Tanya came that afternoon, wrapping her pitch in more sweetness, the way Tanya wraps most things. She was trying to buy a house just a little short on the down payment, and Marco would have wanted to help family, she was sure. He sounded like such a generous man. I told her Marco's generosity had been directed by his own judgment, and that I was directing mine by mine, and that I wasn't in a position to give anyone substantial money while I was still sorting out my own finances. Tanya's sweetness thinned at the edges the way it always does when it encounters a boundary it hadn't expected, and she said she understood in the voice of someone who had no intention of understanding and was planning to try again later. My mother's version came in the evening, framed as an observation about what made practical sense rather than a direct request, a number mentioned with enough specificity that it was clearly something she'd worked out in advance. The family mortgage. Nothing dramatic. Marco was such a generous man, she said, the same phrase Tanya had used, delivered with the same implication that his generosity was a resource that should continue operating past his death and in directions he'd never actually specified. I said I wasn't going to pay the family mortgage. I said it clearly, with enough explanation that the refusal wasn't a closed door but was definitely a real answer. I was managing my own finances carefully. I was still grieving. I hadn't made decisions yet about how to invest or allocate anything. And most importantly, I wasn't going to begin my life as a person with resources by immediately distributing those resources to people who had spent 6 years barely registering that I existed. I didn't say that last part in exactly those words, but it was present in the room anyway, audible in the space between the things I actually said. Diane's turn came 2 days after Christmas, the most pointed and the most revealing of all the requests. She wanted money for her children's education, a specific sum, delivered with the specific confidence of someone who has always believed, at some level, that family resources should naturally flow in her direction, toward the achiever, the oldest, the one who'd always been the family's organized pride, regardless of who had actually done what to generate the resources in question. When I said no, she was the least graceful about it. She talked about family obligation and relationships that couldn't be rebuilt once broken, and whether I understood the consequences of my attitude. Then she said, inevitably, that she hoped I knew what I was doing, the same sentence my mother had offered when I left for Rome, when I told them I was marrying Marco. The family's all-purpose response to every choice of mine they wanted to doubt. Kevin called me selfish. Tanya told me I'd changed, become cold, that losing Marco and gaining money had done something to me that wasn't good. My mother said, in her particular gentle way with sharp things, that she hoped I'd remember money wasn't everything and family was what lasted. A sentiment that arrived on the 4th day of a visit in which the word money had appeared more frequently in conversation than my husband's name. What none of them asked, across 4 days of Christmas with a woman who had loved and lost the person who'd made her life what it was what Marco had actually been like. Nobody asked what 4 years of that marriage had felt like from the inside. Nobody asked about that Tuesday in March, coming home to find him gone. Nobody asked about the year in Rome afterward, what grief felt like in that specific city with those specific memories on every street. The money was the whole of what they saw, and the person whose death had brought it didn't matter, except as a detail in the provenance of the number. I've thought about those 4 days many times since, turned them over, looking for something I might have missed, some reading of the events that makes them less clear than they appeared at the time. What I keep coming back to is how familiar everything felt underneath its new particulars. The same invisibility that had been my experience in that family my whole life, now wearing different clothes. When I had nothing of obvious value, they looked past me. When I had something of obvious value, they looked at the something rather than at me. Neither version involved actually seeing me and the continuity of that. The consistent failure of curiosity about who I actually was, regardless of what I had, was the most honest information the visit provided. I left after New Year's, went back to the apartment I'd rented in the city, and began the slow, careful work of whatever came next. I invested the money properly. with real advisors and real patience, something designed to last rather than impress. I found work I actually wanted to do, which turned out to involve architectural preservation, documenting and protecting older buildings in the city, work that felt like a continuation of everything Marco had taught me to see, and that I could now pursue without anything else weighing on it. My family has been quiet since Christmas, the quiet of people who made requests, received clear answers, and haven't yet decided what to do with that information. Kevin sent the business plan, which I read, which was not a business plan by any meaningful definition, which I said kindly and specifically. Tanya messaged about the house again, which I didn't answer immediately. My mother calls Sundays, like always, and we talk about nothing significant, and neither of us has mentioned Christmas directly, which we've always been good at, keeping the surface intact even when what's underneath it is considerably less smooth. Diane and I haven't spoken since January. I hold that without significant distress. Her silence is her choice and hers to manage. Most mornings I think about Marco, which is where the grief lives now, not in waves, but in small, specific moments of absence. The habit of turning to say something and finding nowhere to turn it. I bought a photograph of the courtyard where we married. The apartment near the Pantheon sold, but the image kept, and it hangs in my apartment here, where I see it first thing every morning. I went back to Rome in October, the best month, the city quieter and more itself, and I walked the streets we walked and ate where we used to eat and spent an afternoon in the lecture room where I raised my hand to ask a question about proportions, and I felt him there the way the living feel the dead in places built from their presence. He left me $10 million, and I'm grateful for it, genuinely and practically, for what it makes possible, for the choices it gives me, for the freedom of building a life I actually want, rather than one I can afford. But the money is the smallest thing he left me, considerably smaller than what I actually brought home. He left me the experience of being seen, specifically and consistently, by another person, something I'd gone 26 years without quite having. He left me Rome, the city, and what it taught me about being present in my own life. He gave me 4 years of proof that the kind of relationship I'd always believed was possible actually was, and that kind of evidence changes how you navigate everything that comes after. My family found out I was worth $10 million on Christmas morning and changed overnight, the way people change when they discover something they want rather than someone they love. What they missed, turning immediately toward the number, was that the number was barely the point. And what hit me, watching them turn toward it, was that some things about my family hadn't changed at all. The same quiet, steady failure to look at me rather than through me or past me, wearing its newest set of clothes on the most ordinary Christmas morning of my entire life.